So for the elephant toothpaste experiment, um, it did work. I didn't have a flask, so I used this container that was smaller on the bottom, but larger on top, and so it's kind of like the opposite of a flask. Um, but I figured it'd do the same thing, and it was like the same concept. Thought about using like a Dasani water bottle, like an empty one, but I didn't know where it was plastic, if it would still do the same thing or not. So for the procedure, I used 10% hydrogen peroxide. I used a few drops of dish soap, a few drops of food coloring, and one packet of yeast. I took hydrogen peroxide and I put a little bit in my um, little container that I used instead of a flask. I put a few drops of dish soap and a few drops of food coloring in there, and then I mixed it together. And then in another, like a small container, I poured the one packet of yeast and I added hot water to it and I mixed it. And then I poured the yeast mixture into my flask and the experiment happened. The process, each tiny foam bubble that was made was filled with oxygen. Yeast acts as a catalyst or helper, which removes the oxygen from the hydrogen peroxide. Since it did it so fast, it creates lots and lots of bubbles. The bottle did get a little warm, but that's because this experiment created a reaction called an exothermic reaction, which means it doesn't only create foam, but it creates heat as well. And the foam in this experiment at the end was made out of water, soap, and oxygen. So what's happening? The foam is made as the soap traps tiny oxygen bubbles created by the chemical reaction that is happening inside the bottle. The thick foam oozes out of the top of the bottle and looks like toothpaste when toothpaste is being squeezed out of its tube. But like I said earlier, I didn't have a container or like a tube that was larger at the bottom and smaller on top. So mine didn't really look like toothpaste coming out of a toothpaste bottle, but it still looked really cool. It's called elephant's toothpaste because the large stream of foam looks like toothpaste that is big enough for an elephant. The hydrogen peroxide is a molecule made up of hydrogen atoms and oxygen atoms. Under the correct conditions, hydrogen peroxide will undergo a chemical reaction to break down into two parts. The two parts are oxygen and water. When a chemical that is made up of only one molecule breaks down into two different similar molecules, it's called a decomposition reaction. And this particular decomposition reaction is also an exothermic reaction, meaning it gives off heat. The yeast contains an enzyme called catalase. It's called this because it works as a catalyst in this reaction. The catalyst is a substance that speeds up the reaction of a chemical reaction without changing the initial products. Yeast is added to the hydrogen peroxide to speed up the reaction. The catalyst in the yeast speeds up the process of breaking down the hydrogen peroxide. Therefore, it produces oxygen and water more quickly. Oxygen gets trapped by the dishwashing detergent as many tiny, tiny bubbles. So I compared this experiment to a real world example. The hydrogen peroxide is commonly found in multiple different hair coloring products. Hydrogen peroxide bleaches the natural pigments we have in our hair by breaking down the hair's melanin, which is the tiny grains of pigment that create natural hair color. As we get older, our bodies continue to produce this hydrogen peroxide, but we continue to make less catalase. There is less catalase available to break down the hydrogen peroxide. The concentration of hydrogen peroxide in our bodies increases, and the increased concentration of hydrogen peroxide that breaks down the melanin in our hair causes our hair to lose its original color and turn into gray and white.